Moderating today's discussion is Judy Olian, Dean of the UCLA Anderson School of Management and the John E. Anderson Chair in Management. Since assuming her role as Dean in 2006, Dean Olian has strengthened UCLA Anderson's focus on leadership, diversity, international business, and global management. Under her leadership, the school has raised over $370 million to support innovative programming and management thought leadership, and to advance UCLA Anderson as one of the leading business schools of management in the world. She also led the creation of the Center of Global Management, and on behalf of the center, I would like to thank the co-sponsors of today's Robertson Lecture Series, the Anderson Tech Business Association, and the Los Angeles World Affairs Council. I am privileged to welcome Mr. Thompson to UCLA Anderson. He joined the Microsoft board in February of 2012, and 2 years later became independent chairman of Microsoft Corporation. He has enjoyed over 40 years of experience in the tech sector. Most recently, he served as the Chief Executive Officer of Virtual Instruments, a privately held company. And prior to this, he was the CEO of internet security company Symantec for 10 years, during which time he helped transform the company into a leader in security, storage, and systems management solutions. Mr. Thompson also held several leadership positions during his 28-year tenure with IBM in the area of sales, marketing, and software development, and he also serves as general manager of IBM Americas. Since 2009, he has been an active investor in early-stage technology companies in Silicon Valley. He currently serves as either an advisor or board member with Illumina, Reviver MX, and Illumio. He also served on the boards of companies such as Fortune Brands, Seagate Technologies, and UPS. In addition to his technology industry, he is also a member of the Board of Trustees for the Wetland America Trust and served on the National Board of Teach for America and on several government commissions. As a student pursuing a career in technology, I am inspired by Mr. Thompson's journey and honored to introduce him today. He has been at the forefront of the dynamic tech industry, shaping and transforming companies through disruptive change. His path illuminates his profound success in leading and guiding organizations to create global impact. Please join me in welcoming our moderator, Dean Judy Olian, and our very distinguished, accomplished, and inspiring guest, Mr. John Thompson.
Thank you, Aubrey, and such a distinguished person deserves such a comprehensive introduction, so thank you. And everyone, it's great to have such an engaged and large and diverse audience here. I'm going to dive right into it because we want to maximize our time, and there will be a little bit of time at the end for you to ask questions, subject to getting you back to classes on time. So let's start with your roots. I think that everyone's a product of their roots somehow. You grew up in Florida, your dad was a postal worker, your mom a teacher. What is it that you are today that harks back to those roots?
Well, I think if anything, my dad said, you got to work hard. And oh, by the way, he worked 20 hours a day. While he was a postman, he also had a bunch of apartments that he managed. He wanted to have the most beautiful yard in our community, so he always mowed the yard or trimmed the hedges when he came in the afternoons. And it put this notion of how important a work ethic was for me at a very, very young age. For my mom, it was all about learning. I had a sister who was 22 months older than me and infinitely smarter than me. And my mom reminded me all the time that you got to be as smart as Brenda if you want to get ahead in life. And so the notion of hard work and never stopping and always learning were the two things that were foundational, if you will, from my parents in West Palm Beach.
And continued for the rest of your life?
Forever. As a matter of fact, that's why I joined a PE firm just recently, because it gives me a chance to learn something new, even at this age.
So let's turn to Microsoft for a moment, and congratulations. Q3 earnings were just announced. They were terrific. I think you're up something like 27% in terms of stock price over the course of the year. There is a lot going on at Microsoft under one roof. Cloud, Windows, Xbox, Surface, LinkedIn, Bing, gaming. So how would you in the elevator speech, characterized the businesses that Microsoft is in, and what do you think it will or should look like in 5 years?
Well, I don't think anyone knows what the industry is going to look like in 5 years, because what we do know is that about every 8 to 10 years there's some inflection point that occurs that causes the industry to change. Just as cloud is that and mobile are those two new things that cause the industry to change. If you had to go back 8 or 10 years, you'd see the web, you'd see client-server computing, you'd see PCs. So you just keep going back and you can see that there's a pattern of change that occurs in the industry. And it's very, very difficult, therefore, to predict what 5 or 10 years from now might look like. That being said, however, in the case of Microsoft, we've got 3 core principles that we believe in, our business units that we try to drive. The first of which is this concept of more personal computing. And it's where our Windows business, our gaming business, a bunch of those things are aggregated under the concept of more personal computing, making it simpler for people to interact with technology and, in fact, have that technology influence, quite frankly, how their lives are performed or lived. Another one is this notion of a more productive business enterprise. And that's, at its core, all about Word and Office, and that's where early on many of you will experience the impact of machine learning and artificial intelligence, because those are places where we can integrate those technologies perhaps easier than elsewhere and have a material impact on how each of us does our jobs or lives our lives. And then the third one is obviously the cloud. And this is a transformational effort that has been underway at Microsoft for quite some time. And I think with the change in leadership that occurred in 2014, the emphasis was shifted from protect and build Windows to build and grow the cloud. And that shift has created both a cultural and attitudinal shift within the company that has been truly amazing to observe, quite frankly. But those are the 3 big categories, if you will.
So let's just focus for a moment on machine learning, AI, AR, because we think about the fact that our lives will change a lot, and maybe the jobs that our MBA students are going into, not maybe, for sure, the jobs that our MBA students are going into are going to change. Microsoft is already venturing into that space. Give us examples of the transformational impact of those new developments, and what do you think will be Microsoft's part in that? I know you have the HoloLens.
Yeah. So let's separate AI and machine learning from virtual reality or augmented reality. So on the AI and machine learning part, I'll give you a classic example. So this morning I got up and I have a trip that I have to make to Europe on the 18th of this month. And I have literally only about 2 days that I can do it, because then I have to meet up with my wife in Atlanta, where we will have...
John's wife, Sandy, is here. Thank you, Sandy.
Where we will have holiday with the family. And so I then spent untold hours on the phone with various and sundry people trying to organize this trip. Well, quite frankly, a intelligence-driven ecosystem would have done much of that for me without me having to do it myself. Another somewhat related example, a few years ago, my assistant and I went to the Microsoft developer conference called Build. And we listened to Satya and members of the team talk about all the things that they were doing in machine learning and artificial intelligence. And she became concerned because she didn't think I was going to need her anymore, because her job was going to go away, because many of the fundamental things that she did for me essentially could be done by the technology itself. And so what you'll see is the technology makes an assumption about what you want to do and goes and does it for you, and then asks your permission to follow through to close the loop, if you will. That's going to have a profound effect on lots and lots and lots of jobs. And while there are many people who want to argue technology is going to ruin the job market, technology has already had a material effect on the job market over the last 50 years. And so we'll have to figure out how we embrace these new technologies just as we embraced the old ones. On the augmented reality front, think about a large manufacturer or hospital where someone is doing a surgical treatment and they can use the concept of augmented reality or the concept of this digital reasoning, if you will, to truly understand what's going on and get input from others while they're in the midst of either a surgical operation or assembling some very, very complex product. And so teaching people how to do difficult and complex things can become much, much easier if they are augmented, if you will, with this notion of I can provide intelligence to you if you can give me real-time insight as to what you're actually doing. So the combination of real-time insight and augmented reality will change the way people do their jobs, and quite frankly, will make some jobs much, much more efficient and quite frankly more productive.
We think about it for education because, of course, augmented reality may mean that you don't actually have to be in here to fully experience John Thompson in the future. And Microsoft's role in these two streams?
Yeah, so I think every company in tech today is playing in the AI machine learning space. You can't find a single large technology company that doesn't have a message around that technology itself. However, not many of them are playing in the virtual reality, augmented reality space. And Microsoft has one, I'll call it a unique advantage, if you will. Most of the technologies that are playing in the space are tethered. In other words, you can only go so far because you've got this cable that connects you to the machine that delivers, if you will, the insights. Because of some of the incredible engineering work that Microsoft has done, they have the only untethered augmented reality set of glasses. And so you can literally walk around an operating room, you could walk around a factory floor, you could walk around a whole bunch of places without being tethered, if you will, to the device, and do a lot more things.
That's the HoloLens.
That's the HoloLens, exactly.
This is a strategy question. You've been on the board when there have been a couple of major acquisitions at Microsoft. LinkedIn, which seems to be going swimmingly. Nokia, which was Microsoft's foray into mobile, which you ended up writing down. Talk about what went through your mind, I mean, as a board member, what the drivers were of these strategic decisions and how you look at them today, and just the general discipline of M&A at the board level at Microsoft.
Well, first off, M&A, 80% of them failed. And that's just not in tech, that's in general in the marketplace. And so you know when you're going into it that it is a high risk endeavor. But generally speaking, you're doing it for one of two reasons. One, you want to move into a new adjacent market that's relevant to what you're doing. Or two, it allows you to aggregate more of the revenues and profits in a given market where you are, and hence make you a more powerful player. In our cases, we were looking at Nokia. There were two business models that were clearly the most successful models in the mobile space at that time. One was the Apple model, which was a fully integrated end-to-end model, and the other was the Google model, which is I build a platform, somebody else worries about the phone, somebody else worries about the apps. That disassociation, if you will, led to a pretty big business for Google. And Microsoft was more in the latter camp than the former camp. And our prior CEO thought, this isn't working for us. And so we need to create a model that looks and feels more like Apple than what we're doing today. And hence that led to the acquisition of Nokia. One of the issues for me as a board member was, okay, if this is what the CEO wants to do, let's probe a little bit. And we did a fair amount of probing. But more importantly than the probing was, in my mind, it was an opportunity for us to use offshore cash. Because Microsoft's got, my gosh, $70, $80 billion offshore. And this was a transaction that was going to be $8 or $9 billion that would have allowed us to put that cash to work, as opposed to just having it sit in some bank in some country overseas. And so the combination of, gee, we need to change the business model, gee, we need to do more to use offshore cash, and gee, if we can make this work, we can move from being a 3% player in the mobile space to maybe being a 8 to 10% player in the mobile space. That was what drove, at least for me, the decision around Nokia.
And in hindsight?
I would do it again. As long as you got $80 billion sitting offshore, as long as you can get an IP portfolio that essentially gives you some rights downstream from even when the phone is gone, because we're still collecting revenues, if you will, from the IP that we have. So I would do it again, make no mistake about it. Now, would we do it differently? Perhaps we should, but that's a statement about what the management team needs to do, not necessarily the board. So let's shift. Let's shift into...
And I'll come back to repatriation of or offshore funds in a moment.
Yeah. I'm surprised you're going to talk about that. Mm-hmm. On LinkedIn, as we were going through the search process for a new CEO, one of the things we asked every candidate, an outside candidate or an inside candidate, was to give us a white paper summary of what you would do to redirect Microsoft or take Microsoft in a different direction. And we wanted to know not just what you would do organically, we wanted some insight into what your inorganic thinking was as well. And I give Satya a lot of credit. He said, I'll buy LinkedIn. And when he came to me and said, we should buy LinkedIn, I'm like, Satya, you've been in the job a year, man. Are you sure you want to spend that kind of money for? And he went, yep, I'm determined.
Because?
And I think more important than his determination was his approach to integration of the company, which was different than some of the things that Janice and I did when we were at Symantec, where generally speaking what you do is you disassemble the thing and then put the pieces into the relevant parts inside the mothership, if you will. In this particular case, what Satya said was the two most successful technology acquisitions ever done in tech were YouTube by Google and Instagram by Facebook. And in each case, they left them alone. They left them with the degree of autonomy and independence that allowed them to grow the business in a manner that was very, very relevant to what they were trying to get done. And they looked for ways to bridge between that entity and the core business, if you will. And that's exactly what we've done with LinkedIn. LinkedIn's business is growing very, very well. I think it grew like almost 20% last quarter. And that's in large part because they feel a degree of independence, but they also feel the connection to the bigger Microsoft. Ironically enough, not only has their business performed well, but attrition is down, employee morale is up, I mean, on and on. So all of the things that you would want to see as the successful outcome of a $26 billion transaction, we're seeing the early signs of those right now.
Let me talk a little bit about some of the issues in the context. One of them being privacy and privacy laws. And Microsoft operates in a global environment with global platforms. The Supreme Court is going to hear a Microsoft case now involving privacy. It has to do with the tension between domestic laws, and there's an Electronic Communications Privacy Act here that was passed in 1986, before ever anyone thought of the internet, and versus privacy laws that exist, for example, in the European Union. And this particular case involves a search warrant where the US Justice Department is trying to obtain information from an Irish data server. And Microsoft is saying, well, wait a minute. If we give you that information, we're violating the sovereignty of Irish privacy rules that are dictated by the EU. And of course, the Justice Department feels very strongly about it, and Microsoft and other tech companies like Apple have joined with you. So talk about the importance of privacy and why there are such high stakes here, and maybe also reference the current framework, the legal framework, and whether it's current enough or...
Yeah. This case all sort of came to a head in December of 2013. I was a little busy in December of 2013 because we were trying to hire a CEO for Microsoft, so I wasn't really paying much attention to this at that time. But what happened was we got a warrant that we had to deliver information from our Dublin, Ireland data center back to the US Justice Department, if you will. And Microsoft decided to take a stand that says, no, we won't do that because, oh, by the way, that data doesn't belong to us. That data belongs to our customers. And we are only the stewards or the custodians of the data, not the owners of the data. And the battle raged on for a few years. And finally, about sometime in 2016, 3 local judges decided in favor of Microsoft. All 3 of them aligned around Microsoft. And that was when the Supreme Court decided, well, gee, in light of this, maybe we should go into this decision a little bit deeper. The fundamental philosophy I think the US government has is that if you are managing information, that's your business insight and business metrics. Well, I don't know how our email keeping, if you will, for someone represents our business records. Those are not our business records. Those are our customers' business records. And so for us to have to share customer data without customers knowing seems to be a little bit odd. In addition, I think the EU is a little bit further along in thinking through the whole digital rights aspect of it, more so than the US. And come the spring of next year, there will be a set of policies that will unfold in Europe that will dictate what data can and cannot be shared. And hence that's why not just Microsoft, but many of the cloud providers are building data centers all around the world because they know that that data has to remain resident in the country in which it was sourced, as opposed to it being able to travel around the world without you as a user even knowing about it.
But even in the United States, I mean, the San Bernardino shooting, where they tried to get access to the cell phone of Apple, I mean, that also evoked some
well, that's a little bit different case there. That case was more about wanting the encryption code broken so that they could have access to that device. That's a little bit different than them coming and saying, I have access to all data that's in this data center independent of who it belongs to, because I can issue a warrant and therefore gain access. So while similar, not quite the same by any stretch of the imagination. I think this case will be a watershed case, quite frankly, for the world at large, because if the US were to win, that creates a very, very different relationship between the United States and every country in which it operates. The US can get access to any data that exists inside a data center if they go to the country and to their client, or the person who's being accused, and let them know that it's going on. You don't have to come to Microsoft or to Google or to Amazon to do that. There are methods by which they could do that, but they want to use this shortcut method, and I just don't think that's right.
Well, and the intricacies and nuances associated with data privacy are going to continue to evolve as digitization continues to evolve.
Correct.
Another contextual question has to do with the proposed tax law reform and what it will do for corporate tax rates. And there are a number of pushes and pulls that may be advantages for corporations and maybe disadvantages. On the one hand, we expect the corporate tax rate to go down and become more competitive. It'll also offer incentives for repatriation of global revenues that reside somewhere, like Microsoft's. But it'll also impose taxes on revenues that are held abroad. So when you try and unpack all of the possibilities associated, and again, it's changing by the minute. I think they're, in fact, reviewing this right now in Congress. How is Microsoft looking and positioning its advocacy vis-a-vis the tax reform?
Well, let me start by saying Microsoft has not taken a public position on tax reform.
Well, just tell us your
this
private view as the
is
Microsoft
Thompsonism
chairman. Yes.
Here. So this is more my opinion than Microsoft's opinion. And I would say that I can't think of any business leader that would not be interested in lower tax rates. I mean, duh. And so we would certainly support this idea of lower tax rates. More importantly, tax reform. Not rate change, but tax reform. And the simple concept of repatriation is we'd love to have the opportunity, but at what cost? And if you go back to 2004, I think it was, the last time we had a repatriation plan, we allowed companies to bring back up to $500 million at a 5.5% rate. And almost every company that had capacity overseas brought it back. I was at Symantec at the time. We brought back $500 million. Well, now, interest rates then were very different than they are today. Interest rates today for a large global conglomerate can be in the 2% range, 3% range. And so if you say, I'm going to charge you 10% to bring the money back, heck, I could borrow against my balance sheet for a heck of a lot less than the 10% tax that is being considered. And so I think people are going to have to think through the implications of what a company could do. Now, if you say, I'm going to penalize you if you don't bring it back.
I think that's part of the deal.
Then that's the threat. And
Right.
the question is, does that threat become
Exceed.
a part of the final bill that does get passed? And I question that myself.
Yeah, so the uniform response is yes, we love lower corporate tax rates,
Show me,
but leave
how
the
many
rest
of you want,
alone.
How many of you want to pay more taxes? No one wants to pay more
Yeah.
taxes, right?
You had the enviable or unenviable role of chairing the committee that selected the new Microsoft CEO, which resulted in Satya Nadella. And I'm interested from a governance perspective as you go forward, this notion of representing shareholders and at the same time supporting the CEO, especially one who you feel a great allegiance to since you chose. So how do you think through your role as chairman of the board of a very public company, representing the public, and at the same time backing up the CEO that you chose?
Yeah. Well, my job is to represent the interests of shareholders in the boardroom. Make no mistake about that. I'm not confused by it, and I don't think anyone else on our board is either. But I also have a responsibility to help the management team of the company, not just Satya, but other members of the management team as well, think through issues that are strategically important to Microsoft that could have a material effect on shareholder value creation. And so while I do my job to make sure the governance aspects of the role are well thought through and well managed, I spend a fair amount of time with Satya and with other members of the team as well, thinking through the strategy of the company, the implications of the strategy on long-term success, and what we should do day in and day out. Now, in the case of Satya, when I was asked to consider the job as chairman of the board, my answer was, I don't want to do that. Why do I want to be chairman of Microsoft? My gosh. And the fear for me at the time was, you got Bill Gates on one shoulder and Steve Ballmer on the other. I've got a pretty small voice compared to either of those guys. And so why would you ever want to take on that role? And I'll give both Satya and Bill more credit than anyone else for pushing me to, John, we need you to do this. We need you to do this. And my big fear was that because Bill and Steve would be on either shoulder, I wouldn't really have much sway, if you will, with Satya. And he and I reached a conclusion very early on that we would talk every Sunday morning for anywhere from 10 minutes to an hour. And it was as much about building a relationship of mutual trust and respect and talking about business issues and all those things. And over the course of the first year that he was in the job, that's what we did. Sandy would have to put up with me every Sunday morning on the phone for an hour. But it created a bond between me and Satya. And that bond hopefully has been helpful to him. It certainly has been helpful to me as an advisor, if you will, to him. So my role is not just governance. My role is also to be an advisor because I've spent 46 years in this industry, so I might know a little bit that could be of some value to one of the operating leaders of the team.
Another contextual factor that we're all living with is cyber violations, cyber threats from a national perspective as really a security issue. From a corporate perspective, we've seen some companies virtually crippled because, Sony, Equifax, and individuals whose lives have been really upended. So other than Symantec as a solution, how do we preserve the great without suffering from the bad?
Well, the greatest security vulnerability we have is us, where we just do stupid things. We make mistakes. And there are people out there who are counting on us making mistakes as they fish or as they spearfish or as they do all of these things that lead to these breaches. So step one in solving this problem is we all got to be a little bit smarter and more thoughtful about what we do and how we interact online. Step two is, at the end of the day, organizations, both institutions like UCLA and commercial organizations like Microsoft, need to do a better job of training their employees on the right security measures and posture that they ought to implement. And if they did a better job, that would raise the consciousness level, I think, of every individual, so he or she is smarter when they get the phished note. I got hacked myself about 1.5 years ago. I was in the midst of doing a deal. I thought that the document that had just come in from the CEO to click on this DocuSign document was to sign for the deal that I was about to do. Well, turns out someone had been monitoring my mailbox. They knew that I was getting email from this individual. They sent me a phished campaign, a spear phish, so it's very specific. I clicked on it and the rest is history. Now, would I have been smarter? Could I have been smarter? Absolutely. And now, every day I get something, every single day. And I think we all have to be very, very cognizant of that pragmatic reality. It's not going to go away. It won't go away.
Especially since there are national strategies to upend our digital security system.
There's as much money going after the bad side of the house as there is investment being made in new security technologies and new security processes. And so that's why I make the point that it's just not going to go away. We have to learn to live and behave differently in a more digital world. And if we're not prepared to do that, we're going to end up with more of these breaches. We will end up with more of these breaches. The question is, how impactful will they be on all of us?
I want you to start preparing your questions. I'll ask just a couple more and turn it over to you. I want to talk about organizational culture issues for a moment. And first, talk about your adjustment to new cultures. I think it's no secret that when you came to IBM, you were not the classic blazer, navy suit, white shirt.
I got on a white shirt now. Look at this.
White shirt, striped tie. I'm told that you were rather hippie-like in those days. And yet, maybe through some gritting of your teeth, you not only adjusted, but you embraced the IBM culture. So what is it that you would advocate for people who are very much individualists in terms of fitting in to cultures? And what did that teach you yourself about embracing differences and inclusivity in
So in my early days at IBM, I used to wear two sister suits. How many of you know what two sister suits are? Polly and Esther. Because they could come in all kinds of colors and what have you. I love that stuff. That wasn't the IBM way for sure. But I had been at IBM about 3.5 years, and I got my first big promotion, which was to go from a sales job in a local branch office in Tampa, Florida, to a regional staff job, or district staff job in Atlanta. And I'd been in the job about 6 months, and I looked up one day and I said, I don't look like anybody else in this room. And it had nothing to do with my ethnicity. It had everything to do with the fact that I had on my polyester suit and a striped shirt and a big flowered tie and a big afro. And I'm like, boy, you know, I could miss out on the next opportunity because I'm not conforming. And I'd better find a way to conform, or my performance may not carry me to the next opportunity. And so I then went out and I bought a blue suit, a wool suit at that. I mean, oh my gosh.
Can I interrupt
Sure.
for 1 second? So the flip side of your observation is that some might say that inclusive cultures do not require you to adjust in order to succeed.
Yeah, remember, this was 1973, 74. I don't think we even knew what an inclusive culture was in 1974. And so this notion of inclusive culture is more a modern phenomenon than what it was back in that time. And in those days, candidly, success in IBM was about conforming to and being a part of the culture of the company. I went from being the polyester guy to being a Brooks Brothers model because I recognized that I didn't want that to become the reason that they said, no, you're not going to get this job. So I got the button-down shirt and all that crap. But that was it. And guess what? It never became an issue ever again. Now, when I would go home, people would go, look at you, man, what is wrong with you? Because that is not the way I grew up. But if you wanted to become a part of the culture of IBM and you wanted to have a successful career in IBM, you had to embrace the things that were considered the standards of IBM. And one of the standards of IBM in those days, for men at least, was a blue suit, a white shirt, a red and blue and white striped tie, and a pair of tassel loafers or wingtips. And if you weren't a part of that, guess what? You could be eliminated without even knowing it. And I just did not want that to be the reason, if you will, that I did not have an opportunity to progress, if you will, from a career perspective.
And now fast forward today.
Now today, it's a very, very different thing. Mm-hmm. It's all about, particularly in tech, it's all about intellect. Intellect trumps everything. And hence, that's in large part why we have some of the diversity and inclusion issues that we do in tech, because not enough people of color, not enough women focus on the technology element, if you will, and therefore the tech companies will say, I'm always looking for the next technologist, I'm looking for the next tech idea, and therefore if you don't have one of those backgrounds, I'll go look elsewhere. We have got to fix that. Now, part of that stems from the weak educational system we have in the country. We went from first to worst in US public education. And guess what? Countries like India, China, Japan, they focus more on STEM and getting the foundational level in place for all of their kids, which we don't do enough of that here in the US. Now, that's no excuse for not having a more diverse workforce, but by the same token, if you're focusing on intellect, boy, you've got to have an intellect pool that you can choose from. My sense is that tech in general could do more, make no mistake about it. 2/3 of the jobs in a tech company are not engineering jobs. So why is it that more of those jobs aren't occupied by women or people of color? I don't know. And we need to do a better job. I look at what Microsoft has done under Satya's role, and every year since he's been in the job, the diversity of the company has progressed.
And how? What has he done? What are the levers?
Well, it's more about recruiting. Now, as I spoke at the annual Global HR Conference a couple of weeks ago. I said it's one thing to have the core of the company go from, I'll have the numbers wrong, but 4.3% African American to 4.6% African American. That's terrific. But now let's look at the levels within the company. What does the senior level look like versus the entry level? And oh, by the way, diversity and inclusion is about the whole company, not just about the total pool. And so I think they're doing a much, much better job of thinking through now, how do we not just manage the size of the pool and the diversity of the pool, but how do we make sure that people at all levels, or every level of the organization, is a more diverse level than before. And I think it's going to take some time, But you have to have a management team that is maniacally focused on getting it done. And I think that clearly is the case at Microsoft.
Time for your questions.
Hi, Chairman Thompson. My name is Addie Rajpura.
I'm John.
Okay.
My dad used to be Chairman Thompson.
Hi, John. I'm Addie Rajpura. I'm a first-year student at UCLA Anderson. Thank you for being here. So earlier this summer, I was at the Forte conference for women in business, and I heard someone, an executive at Whirlpool, speak, and she said that every company is becoming a technology company nowadays, because that's how we're moving forward. But I'm also seeing a trend in the tech space, and that we are rapidly changing what life looks like. You mentioned your assistant. She's concerned that maybe her job will go away. To what extent do you see the tech companies becoming social behavior companies or philosophy companies, both Microsoft and the tech industry in general?
Well, maybe Google, but not Microsoft. I don't think at least company, and you have to parse the tech space for those who are focused on the enterprise versus those who are focused on the consumer. And you are likely to see a very different genre of what they're trying to get done at their consumer focus, a la Google or Facebook, versus enterprise focus like Microsoft or Oracle or some of those companies. I think what is inevitable is what was suggested, which is every company will become much, much more in-depth at using technology to move their agenda forward. For case in point, I had dinner just last Tuesday night with the CEO of one of the largest industrial companies in the world. And we spent most of our time talking about how you integrate information technology into the technology that he builds that's all about robots and assembly lines and all of the things that make cars and trucks and all the things that you and I have become accustomed to. But he knows that the more that he can integrate technology into his business, the more efficient the process will be and the better quality of product will be on the back end. And that is where Microsoft is focused. And that's candidly more my background, which is more on the industrial side than on the consumer side. I've invested in a few consumer companies, and I can assure you I don't know anything about them. I don't have a clue. And I tell the owners and CEOs, don't ask me for advice because I'm not the one to give you advice because my background is not consumer related. But those are the companies that are more likely to have this social aspect to it that will in fact change society as time goes on.
Thank you. And we're going to try and move through these questions concisely. Go ahead.
My name is Jay. I'm a first-year FAMBA student. My question is, how did you handle the situation between activist investor ValueAct and Microsoft in 2013?
Yeah, good question.
Thank you, Jay.
So ValueAct emerged right as we were about to start our CEO search. And the last thing we wanted as a board was to have an argument going with an activist during a period of time that we're trying to recruit a new CEO to the company. And so we made the call that said, we will embrace ValueAct and bring them in. Now, a lot of background work went into that, and one of the background checks that we did was an outreach to the CEO of a very, very large pharma company who had been on the board of a company with a ValueAct member. And so I called that CEO and said, okay, you know ValueAct, tell me about the firm and tell me about the players in the firm. And his answer was, it's not about the firm. It's all about who from the firm you pick to join your board. And that was the best advice I could have ever gotten in that particular situation, because we recruited Mason Morfitt. And that individual said to me, Mason is in fact the best board member I've ever worked with. And now some 3 years later, I will agree with that. He is the best board member I've ever worked with. And ValueAct is not like your typical activist firm that wants to have headlines and want to paint you a picture or paint a picture of you that's not really true. ValueAct is more, in my mind, like a private equity firm that's taken a firm from public to private, and they're working with the management team to improve the operating results of the company. That's the way Value Act operated. And it was a pleasure to work with Mason. He's leaving us. He's not going to be on the slate. The proxy just went out, so he's not on the slate for this term. And so we'll be back to being without an activist.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is M. Can you address our security issues with the cloud, please?
Well, that's cloud security. There's no difference, candidly, in cloud security versus the security of the online environment that you've lived in for the last 10 years. What is different, however, is just the sheer scope and scale and the size of the cloud infrastructure and the number of users that are accessing that common infrastructure. And as a result of that size and scale, without better tools, and better management processes, and quite frankly, smarter people running it, the cloud could in fact become a much, much more vulnerable thing than the smaller protected world that we've lived in for the last 15 or 20 years. That being said, I would argue that Facebook, Google, Microsoft, Oracle, all these big cloud providers, they are doing more on security because they know that that's the number one issue on every client's mind. Is my data going to be secure if I put it in your cloud? And they know for sure that the minute they have a publicly known breach, that wipes out their business. And so the amount of investment that has been made in security infrastructure to protect these public clouds goes over the top compared to what most businesses did during the period of time, quite frankly, that I was running Symantec.
Thank you.
My name is Jim Peterson, GSM 1985. You touched on something that I think there might be a solution that I can mention that I work with. You mentioned that we need more women, more minorities, more inclusion. I'm a Science Olympiad coach at Sayreville Middle School in Orange County. I've been doing it for 14 years. And our students are learning science and technology, like learning to play the piano at a young age when their minds can absorb things. And so watching these kids in the 6 years that are in 7th grade to high school, and then watching them go to Caltech and watching them go to Berkeley and watching them go to MIT it tugs at my heartstrings. But I'd like to put in a shameless plug. Go to www.scioli.com, and if you think that that's a good program, then get behind it.
Okay, thank you, Jim. But I mean,
well, ironically enough, what people would tell you was if you could find an accomplished musician, that individual, he or she, could become an awesome coder because there is a pattern of how music is played out that's not unlike the patterns, if you will, around writing effective code. So produce more musicians, man. We'll come get them from you.
I also sing in Christ Cathedral Choir.
But the point is that we have to reach far earlier in the pipeline to have an effect. Okay, you'll be the last question from that side.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Nick. I'm a fully employed MBA student, and I had a question about blockchain. So you mentioned that there are inflection points occurring every 8 to 10 years. Microsoft currently has an Azure blockchain as a service product, has a partnership with Bank of America, and is part of the Ethereum Alliance, with Microsoft recently attending the developers conference in Cancun last week. IBM and Goldman Sachs are also big players in this space. Could you please speak on how important you see blockchain or distributed ledger technology being to Microsoft and its disruptive potential compared to other recent inflection points?
Yeah, good question.
Thank you.
So blockchain is essentially a data storage, data management company that allows you to manage transaction rates that are significantly beyond what we are accustomed to. Some people would think about them in the context of 100,000 transactions a second as opposed to 10 or 20,000 transactions a second. So think about scaling up a cloud-based environment where you've got all these transactions coming at you, and what you need is the capacity on the back end to be able to handle that. And blockchain is proven so far to be more effective than any other technology in that particular category. Ironically enough, I'm an investor in a little company called Store One. And Store One has a blockchain underpinning, if you will, for its technology. And the simple thesis is we can deliver storage-related management tools at a lower cost and higher capacity than anyone else on the planet. And that's fundamentally what blockchain is all about. How do you deal with a growing cloud ecosystem, an environment where more transactions are going to occur than less, and therefore you'll need a back end to be able to keep up with it.
I'll make a shameless plug on behalf of Anderson. So we have a course, an elective course on the transformational impact of Bitcoin and blockchain, just in case you want to come back to school. I have two quick questions to end here. One has to do with your own leadership. I mean, you've led mega billion-dollar companies or segments of companies. At IBM, you went to a much smaller foray in Silicon Valley in Symantec, which you transformed. You ran a tiny Virtual Instruments, a startup that has since merged with 100 employees, I think, at the time. And now you're in PE. So do you change as you go from leading these different scale companies?
No, I'm the same guy, polyester, you know.
Do you change in your leadership?
I don't think the core of your leadership changes at all, because the core of your leadership should be about principles, the things that drive you to make the right choices. But your attitude has to change. So when I joined Virtual Instruments, we had 52 employees. Well, when I left Symantec, we had over 25,000 employees, I think. And so you don't get to touch 25,000 people, but you do get to touch 52. And so it creates a very different personal relationship between you and the team when you're running something infinitely smaller. When I left IBM, the group that I had responsibility for was roughly $37 billion in revenue, about 35,000 employees. When I joined Symantec, it had $630 million in trailing 12-month revenues and 2,500 employees. A very different world. You don't want to take the IBM view of the world to that environment, but you do want to take the principles that drive you: integrity, forthrightness, candor. All of those things become critically important to a leader as he or she is trying to establish themselves with an organization of tens of thousands or two or three. Because integrity matters to everyone, regardless of the size of the organization.
And yet you know that not every leader is successful in different formats, in different contexts.
Well, if leaders go with a pre-fixed view of how you're going to run something, then odds are if you go from 37,000 to 2,500 to 52 and try to run the same model, that's not going to work. I mean, that's my view of the world, and I think leaders who view the world differently than that will see whose long-term track record is better.
Final question, asking you to go back to the future. You're John Thompson, graduating in 2018 from this great MBA program. Where do you see yourself in terms of the growth opportunities? Where would you say, this is where I want to be?
Tech. I mean,
duh. Yeah. Well, of course, that's where that's the single largest employer.
I think what is critical today is that you have a passion for what it is that you do. I'll never forget when IBM came on campus looking for salespeople. The guy who ran outplacement services for the institution was a fraternity brother of mine, and he came to me and said, "Gee, John, IBM's going to look for salespeople on campus. We think you should go and interview." Well, I had been a salesman for 2 years selling stereo equipment my last 2 years in college. I went, "Look at me. I got an 800-pound afro, a mustache, a beard. You know, I got two-tone shoes. I mean, come on. I can't work for IBM." And he says, Yeah, you can, because they're looking for salespeople. And you're a salesman. And for 46 years or more, I've been a salesman. I've been passionate about that idea. And I think it's important for every one of you, once you decide what it is you want to do, have it manifest itself through the passion that you demonstrate day in and day out in the job. And if you do that, guess what? Your career will be illustrious. I'm convinced of that.
And you're not going to pick an industry that's a bit narrower than tech.
No, because tech, as someone just said, tech's taken over the world. And so you figure out what component of tech you want to spend time in. But this is an industry that has, in fact, changed the world so far, and we've only just begun. We've only just begun.
Well, thank you for illustrating how it is to be successful across a lot of domains and to bring change, good change behind you. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much.